Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches The Great Gatsby. In this video, we'll be taking a detailed look at Chapter 4, focusing on character development and theme, as well as analysing language and structural features along the way. It is a cracking chapter because this is the one where we finally find out the history of Daisy and Gatsby's relationship. We're also given some other information about Gatsby's past, but whether we can believe it or not is up for debate. So let's get started. Let's start off with a quick plot summary. So the chapter begins with a detailed description of all of the people that came to Gatsby's house in the summer. In fact, that's the sentence that ends the enormous list of every single type of person that comes to Gatsby's house across that sequence of weekends, both East Eggers and West Eggers. Fitzgerald is trying to demonstrate to us the vastness and the scale of the parties, but also the types of people that went, whether or not new money or old money, with plenty of hints of the sort of sordid nature of some of those individuals. It then moves from the broad, this kind of broad and vague description, to the narrow. This chapter is really about getting to know Gatsby, or getting to know the version of Gatsby that he wishes to present. He and Nick are going out for lunch together in New York. They're going to a little speakeasy for a little bite to eat. And en route there, Gatsby tells Nick that he wants to tell him more about his life, that it's really important to him that Nick understands more about him and doesn't necessarily buy into the rumours that he's heard. So he tells him these extraordinary stories about his time at Oxford, where his travels, where he hunted big game and collected rubies and painted a little. But he also talks about his experiences in the war and how he became a decorated soldier. So all of this is being given to Nick as a kind of portrait of who Gatsby is and was and where he came from. And all done to assure Nick in some way that he's a good guy. Now, when they get to the restaurant that they're having lunch, we're introduced to another character called Meyer Wolfsheim. A picture of him from the Baz Luhrmann film there. And it's quite clear from word go that Wolfsheim has some fairly shady connections. So despite all of Gatsby's presentation of himself, a lot of it is undermined by the sort of, like I said, the shadiness of some of the business dealings of this supposed, potential mobster that Gatsby is acquainted with. At the end of the lunch, they actually bump into Tom Buchanan, and Gatsby disappears all of a sudden. Now, in that lunch, he had also told Nick that his plan was for Nick to talk to Jordan Baker about a story that he wanted him to know. This upsets Nick a little bit because he's like, oh, for goodness sake, am I not allowed to just, have lunch or have tea with a lady without having the conversation dictated? But actually what happens is Jordan tells him another story of Gatsby's past, one that involves Daisy, and explains that 5 years previously, Daisy and Gatsby were involved, but weren't able to, be together. Gatsby went off to the war. Enter Tom Buchanan into the scene. So despite Daisy's heartbreak over Gatsby, she ends up doing what she should, which is marrying the right kind of man. But Jordan tells the story that on the eve of her wedding, the night before her wedding, I should say, they find her drunk, absolutely drunk as a skunk. And she's gripping this love letter, and she's gripping it in her hands. And she's also thrown this very spectacular present that Tom Buchanan has given her of these pearls, which are worth a phenomenal amount of money, into the bin. And basically Jordan has to sober her up and sort her out. And the end of it is that she chooses Tom Buchanan. She chooses pearls over paper, and Tom Buchanan she marries the very next day, cool as a cucumber. Jordan then goes on to explain that within weeks Tom is already cheating on Daisy. So let's take a little look at the way that Gatsby describes his past to Nick. So this is when they're driving in the car into New York. He says, I was brought up in America but educated at Oxford, so as in Oxford University, England, because all my ancestors, so note the focus on heritage and past, have been educated there for many years. It's a family tradition. He looked at me sideways, always a little shifty, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase educated at Oxford, or swallowed it, or choked on it, as though it had bothered him before. Have a little look at the language and the structural features there. It's sort of slightly triadic. He hurried it, or swallowed it, or choked on it. Notice how it's getting progressively worse, all demonstrating a sort of insecurity with the way that he's saying the words. So it's a massive hint that there's something not quite right about this description of his past. Love the metaphor of swallowing the words, but then the idea of them choking him. So it's actually quite unpleasant for him to sort of get this phrase out. And this is why Nick felt that his whole statement fell to pieces, and he even starts doubting his moral compass. Perhaps there is something sinister about him after all. Gatsby makes a little bit of a mistake here by telling him that he is from the Midwest and then labeling San Francisco, which is of course right west, it's West Coast. And now we get this extraordinary description of his past that I alluded to in the plot summary. Look at the way he lists. After that, I lived like a young Raja in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome. So he lists his destinations, demonstrating himself as far-flung and a traveller. There's something quite romantic about the concept of travelling through Europe. And then look what he's been getting up to, apparently. Collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago. Now this bit perhaps is the genuine bit, isn't it? Because that is what he was doing. He's trying to forget Daisy or trying to find a way to move on. But if you look at this listing here, okay, this asyndetic listing of all of his not achievements, but his pastimes, it's so over the top, it's so overly romantic that it's ridiculous, which is why we've got this wonderful metaphor here by Nick. The very phrases were worn so threadbare, like he's had to say them, they're so well rehearsed that Nick can see through them. And in fact, all that they do is create this turbaned character leaking sawdust at every pore. So another metaphor that suggests the idea of construct, that Gatsby's persona is so clearly constructed, is so clearly fake, that Nick can see all of the flaws in it. In fact, he uses this simile. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines that demonstrates the falsity of this. Now, what's interesting is when he talked about being educated at Oxford, there was something uncomfortable for him. Yeah, so it was difficult for him to say the words, whereas this story has been really well rehearsed. He's not choking on those words. It's the rehearsal of them that suggests falsity. So there is a difference in the presentation of these two stories. But then something shifts, because he gives Nick proof in the form of a photograph of him at Oxford University and his medals from the war. And so suddenly Nick buys into it. He says, then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of rubies to ease with their crimson lighted depths the gnawings of his broken heart. Note the anaphoric structure there, repeating, I saw, demonstrating Nick almost like reevaluating everything that he's been told and buying into it, including this metaphor, the gnawings of his broken heart. So suddenly there's this sympathy for him and his broken heart. So the purpose in telling Nick all of these things is not yet clear. But what is clear is that he wants Nick to have a good impression of him. And then he meets Wolfsheim. Now, this is a really problematic bit of reading because of the way that Fitzgerald describes this character. And what we see here is a real sign of some of the discrimination and prejudice of the time, because these descriptions are really, really drawing upon stereotypical anti-Semitic portrayals of Jewish people. So it does feel quite problematic, particularly this quote in front of us here. A small flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment I discovered his tiny eyes in the half darkness. Fitzgerald is trying to draw attention to the fact that this is a suspicious character with possible dodgy dealings, but unfortunately he's drawing upon, like I said, stereotypes that just aren't acceptable. The only good news in this is that later on in life, it does seem that Fitzgerald kind of had a little bit of personal growth and had learnt from his ways and stopped portraying Jewish people in this way. But for now, unfortunately, it is uncomfortable reading. If we actually just take Wolfsheim and think about what his purpose in this moment in this chapter is, because it's rather at cross purposes. Gatsby wants Wolfsheim to talk him up to Nick, but there is some confusion. Firstly, we discover that he has some connections to the mob. This is a story, an anecdote he's telling. I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. Rosie Rosenthal was a real person, a real mafia person. And so by Wolfsheim being present at the moment, we're learning that one of Gatsby's friends is associated with the mob. Okay, so kind of undermines the grandeur of Gatsby's character. Wolfsheim then goes into quite a lot of detail. This is when Gatsby is out of hearing. He's gone off and it's just the 2 of them together. And he says, I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister. He paused. I see you're looking at my cuff buttons. I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. Well, I inspected them. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, he flipped his sleeves up under his coat. Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife. So one half of this conversation, he's bigging up Gatsby. The other half of his conversation, he's pointing out that he's got human teeth as cufflinks, which obviously makes him seem quite sinister and dark. So do we trust this very positive view of Gatsby? It's certainly a very mismanaged moment if Gatsby was hoping that this would help Nick get on side. If you actually look at the way that he is talking him up, Wolfsheim says he's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister, and that he would never so much as look at a friend's wife. He's certainly going to efforts to suggest that Gatsby is someone trustworthy when it comes to the world of romance, when it comes to treatment of women. Obviously very important considering what we are about to learn, what we're about to read about his relationship with Daisy. It's almost like Gatsby is worried that Nick will judge him because, of course, he is friends with Tom Buchanan. After Wolfsheim leaves, we have another fact about him. Gatsby tells us, or Gatsby tells Nick, that he was a gambler, then coolly adding he's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1919. Again, another real event. So contextually, Fitzgerald is drawing upon real crimes, real mobster criminalities, and associating Wolfsheim with it. So again, it's all about focusing on, well, who are Gatsby's friends? You know, it's like tarring Gatsby with that same brush, and it therefore undermines the work he's doing to construct this view of himself to Nick. Okay, moving on to a slightly different part of the chapter. Just wanted to draw your attention to what we call a framed narrative. When we move into another section of the past, where we learn about Gatsby's relationship with Daisy, it's narrated in the first person from the perspective of Jordan. Which is very, very interesting because, of course, what we've got is a story being told through the lens of Nick. We're meant to just sort of take that these are Jordan's words, like Nick was able to remember it bang on. We've got to remember that Nick always has a level of unreliability because, of course, he is making Gatsby great. But look at the way this framed narrative begins. One October day in 1917. So obviously we're drawing attention to the past, the fact that this 5 years previously. But if you look at the way that that temporal discourse marker begins with 1 October day, it has that very kind of storytelling narrative style, almost drawing upon fairy tales, the once upon a time. We're meant to consider this part of the story the romantic part, the very special part. And then we have in parenthesis Nick explaining to us as the reader who we're listening to, said Jordan Baker that afternoon. So we're meant to understand from this point forward, all of that first person narrative is Jordan. And then we get the story of their love, the love of Gatsby and Daisy. Let's look at a few examples of the narrative. So this is when Jordan sees or meets Gatsby for the first time. She's walking along the road and she sees Daisy and Gatsby in Daisy's little white roadster in her little car. The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime. And because it seemed romantic to me, I've remembered the incident ever since. His name was J. Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realise it was the same man. So note the romance of this moment, this idea about the loving look. It's been kind of romanticised and remembered over time, this idea that theirs is a love that anybody would want, that she's almost not jealous in a negative way, but you know, it's affected her enough to remember it, this passing, fleeting look between Daisy and Gatsby. But obviously Gatsby then left and Daisy is devastated, but eventually she has to pick herself up. She has to do what all young women of that class do, and that is marry well, you know, marry into a class that is appropriate for her own. And so on the night of the wedding, the night before the wedding, I should say, this is the description. This is how Jordan finds her, drunk as a skunk. Here, dearies. She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. Take 'em downstairs and give 'em back to whoever they belong to. Tell 'em all Daisy's changed her mind. Say Daisy's changed her mind. She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up in a wet ball and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. This is such a powerful moment of symbolism because this is all about the choice. This is the moment, the decision. She's obviously highly emotional, hence being so drunk. And I love the way that, you know, we've got things written slightly phonetically to demonstrate that drunkenness. But look what she says about this string of pearls worth a phenomenal amount of money. Take them downstairs and give them back to whoever they belong to. Notice the vagueness of that. She doesn't say Tom. And because she doesn't say Tom, there's a suggestion that they could belong to anyone, that he could give them to anyone, and that Daisy has changed her mind. Say, Daisy's changed her mind, because what she wants in this moment is Gatsby. So if Tom is symbolized by those pearls, if those pearls are a representation of Tom and his wealth and that choice, what represents Gatsby is the paper, pearls and paper. Obviously a reminder of Gatsby's position, that he is not wealthy enough to offer her what Tom can, but she's holding on to that paper that is so representative of Gatsby. She's holding on to it, but then it comes to pieces like snow. That simile demonstrating the kind of almost disintegration of her resolve to not marry Tom and to stay with Gatsby, or to wait for Gatsby, I should say, because he's obviously gone off to war. But ultimately she chooses Tom. She chooses pearls, symbolically. And she has to do it without so much as a shiver. She has to commit. She has to move on, and so she does. But the sad part of that decision making is that a week after Jordan left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. So we can see right from the very beginning of their marriage, he was cheating on Daisy. Note again, another moment of symbolism, the fact that the adultery was discovered because of a car crash where a front wheel of his car is ripped off. It's another extension of driving and cars being a wider extended metaphor for relationships, particularly relationships that are reckless and dangerous. You might also draw attention to the fact that he's cheating on Daisy with a chambermaid, another example of him cheating with a woman of low class, because to him that is meaningless. He's not going to leave his wife for a chambermaid or for a myrtle. It's just his way of getting what he wants without, in his mind, jeopardizing his marriage. Obviously, this explains a lot to Nick about Gatsby and so many of those mysteries about his character. So when Jordan tells him that Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay, it sort of consolidates this belief that he had sort of had about Gatsby, but had kept losing his faith in Gatsby, and now suddenly he has it back because he realizes that it had not been merely the stars to which he aspired to on that June night. So that is a reference to all the way back at the end of chapter 1, where he sees Gatsby stretching out his hand, trembling with desperation and desire, and he realizes that what he was doing was reaching out to Daisy, that green light represents the dream that is Daisy. And in that moment, he comes alive. Gatsby comes alive to Nick, metaphor, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. So this is a metaphor of birth, that up until this point, Gatsby had been in the womb of purposeless splendor. So this sort of waiting period where nothing had any meaning, nothing had any sense. But now suddenly he's been delivered. It's no longer purposeless. He now recognizes that Gatsby had a plan all along. This is one of those moments where Gatsby is becoming great to Nick. Gatsby's becoming great to Nick, but is Nick becoming great to us? Debatable. At the end of this chapter, we have another description of his relationship with Jordan, because all of this musing on Gatsby's relationship with Daisy and Tom's relationship with Daisy leads Nick to have a little moment of self-reflection. And in this moment, driving along in the dark as they dip under the bridge, he puts his arm around Jordan's golden shoulder, drawing her towards him and asking her to dinner. He wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of his arm. Let's look at those adjectives in that little triad. Clean, hard, limited. It's another moment where Nick is suggesting that in some way Jordan doesn't have feelings. Jordan is limited in some way, not able to love, not able to be hurt, because she's hard, she's clean, she's to the point. And it's her hardness that means that Nick says, yes, you're the one for me. He continues this line of thought by admitting that unlike Gatsby and Tom, he had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices, and blinding signs. So he's basically saying he doesn't have an obsession. He doesn't have a dream in the form of a woman. So Jordan will do. He tightens his arms around her. Her one scornful mouth smiled. Again, this idea about her scornful mouth. She's hard, she's limited, she's scornful. She can't be hurt in Nick's view. And so he draws her closer. The fear once more here is that Nick is making assumptions, making judgments about her, and therefore becoming as reckless a driver, metaphorically, as Tom or Gatsby. And there we shall end it. I hope that was interesting. I hope that was useful. I hope that answered questions. But if you have more questions, please just pop them in the comments and I will come back to you. I will always answer any questions that you have, or if you have any requests for any other material, please do let me know. So otherwise, all there is to say is thank you for watching. Oh, and subscribe if you haven't already. Do click that button so you can see what other videos are coming your way. Otherwise, happy reading and massive happy revising.